Two twins are humiliated by white bullies, but they hide a brutal secret. The morning Isla and Amara walked through the gates of Harper Ridge Middle School, no one noticed. There were no whispers, no wide eyes, no typical frenzy that accompanies new students. They were just two small black girls with braided hair tied up with worn blue ribbons and backpacks so shabby that they seemed to have survived several cities. Their steps were synchronized, light, almost as if they had trained themselves to walk without making noise. They didn't smile, they didn't talk, they just watched. And for those who live on appearances, this was enough to make them invisible. But not for long. They were placed in Class 7B in the middle of the semester, which in itself was already a reason for them to be left out. The science teacher only indicated 2 desks at the back of the room, without bothering to know more than their names. Ayla Tolliver, Amara Tolliver, he said dryly, reading the file. During the call, the students continued talking. No one offered help, no one started a conversation. It was as if they were not even there. And for the twins, this was nothing. They learned early on that in some places, being invisible is safer than being noticed. At lunchtime, they sat together in a corner near the wall, with their backs to the cafeteria, while the other groups laughed loudly, exchanged cell phones, and pushed trays. Ayla and Amara ate slowly in silence. They exchanged few words, and when they did, it was almost as if they communicated by code. They watched mainly. The group leaders, the loudest laughs, who followed whom, where were the toilets, where the sun came in the afternoon. It wasn't fear, it was strategy, and they were very good at it. In physical education, they ran with others without standing out. They didn't try to win, they didn't try to lose. They passed by the court like well-trained shadows. When the teacher called to form pairs for basketball, no one chose them. They played each other as always. Only one second-grade girl commented quietly, "Strange," but neither of them reacted. Not because they didn't listen, but because they learned that the best answer sometimes is to keep, until it is necessary. The first week passed like this. Silence, observation, routine. Teachers barely knew how to distinguish them, and classmates just called them the new girls. But what no one saw was what they carried. A discipline sculpted in years of training with their grandfather in the backyard of their home. A rigid man, ex-combatant and karate master, who taught them to breathe first, act later, to fall with dignity, lifting with technique, to never fight out of anger, but never to bow your head when the blow came. On a Wednesday afternoon while leaving school, a soccer ball rolled towards the girls in the parking lot. A boy ran after it, and seeing Ayla hold the ball with a quick and precise foot, his eyes widened. "Do you play?" he asked. Ayla just returned the ball with a straight and clean shot. The boy smiled, half impressed, half suspicious. Amara said nothing, but in that brief second something changed. A flash, a sign that there was more there than people were seeing. But at schools like Harper Ridge, silence isn't just ignored, it's misunderstood. What Ayla and Amara saw as self-protection, others began to see as arrogance. "They think they're too much," someone commented in the locker room. "They don't even look at us in the face," said another. And, as always, the spark began to grow, because there are those who do not know how to deal with the mystery. And there are those who can't stand the fact that someone smaller, quieter, may be hiding something they will never have. Absolute control. It was on a Friday, just before recess, that the first real movement took place. The class had just come out of a surprise math test, and tempers were irritable. Ayla and Amara, as always, walked together to the back patio, a less crowded area where they used to snack in peace. They were sitting on the floor, sharing a piece of cheese bread and a bottle of juice, when 3 shadows approached in silence. Chase Morgan was ahead. Tall, blonde hair shaved on the sides, expensive sneakers, and the kind of smile that never meant a good thing. Behind him, 2 friends, Bryce, strong and debauched, and Eli, the sarcastic repeater of the 8th grade. Chase began with an innocent question. "Are you really twins?" Or do they only wear the same haircut because they don't have a mirror at home? The two friends laughed as if it were genius. Ayla looked at him once, then turned her eyes to the snack. Amara simply wiped her mouth with a napkin and remained silent. Chase was bothered by this. He was used to being answered, or feared. What's wrong? Were they mute? Or are you thinking of attacking me with sorcery? Bryce slapped him on the back, laughing. Eli took his phone out of his pocket and, started recording. Without warning, Chase gave a light kick to the juice bottle, which tipped over and spilled to the ground between them. Amara frowned. Ayla adjusted her backpack without saying anything. The gesture was as subtle as it was firm, and it made the boys hesitate for a second. There was no screaming, no threat. But something in the air has changed. The kind of silence that precedes thunder. Chase realized that he wasn't in control as he thought, and that moved him. That was just a warning, he said before turning his back. But his tone was no longer so sure. In the next class, no one talked about what they saw, but the eyes of her classmates began to spy on the girls with another curiosity. Some laughed softly when the bullies passed by. Others just watched from afar. For the school, it was just an irrelevant episode. For the sisters, it was confirmation that the environment was about to change. They knew the pattern. They had seen this happen before. First comes the provocation, then the climb, and when the oppressor feels the ego hurt, the situation becomes dangerous. On the bus home, Ayla leaned her head against the window. Amara was sitting next to her, distractedly fiddling with the zipper of her backpack. None of them commented on what happened, but both knew they were being tested. It was not the first time, and it probably wouldn't be the last. When they got home, the grandfather was already in the backyard, cleaning the training mat. He looked at them carefully. He didn't ask anything. He only nodded. They understood. Time to practice. The next 2 hours were of silence, sweat and focus, clean strokes, controlled breathing, firm posture. The grandfather watched every movement as if reading a well-known book. Firmer on the hips, Ayla. Amara, lower the center. It wasn't about the fight. It was about balance. He always said, the first victory is not having to fight. The second is to be ready when the choice is not yours. That night, Ayla dreamed of the courtyard. But in the dream, she was the one who kicked the bottle back. The weekend passed without major events, but tension had already settled in the school's structure. The girls' fame began to grow, even without any words. Someone said they knew jujitsu. Another assured that they saw the two training at a sports center in the city. Neither version was entirely true, but like every urban legend, a thread of fear was enough to set the rest on fire. And Chase, he was no longer mocking. Now he was preparing. The following Monday, the air felt heavier in the hallways of Harper Ridge. Not because of the weather, the sun was even strong for an early winter, but because of what was not said. Chase and his friends were quieter than usual. Bryce walked around with the air of someone who wanted to tease, but something in his eyes gave away that there was hesitation. Eli pretended to be bored, but he checked his cell phone frequently as if expecting something. And Ayla and Amara, they continued in the same way, silent, attentive, and now, feared. During the physical education class, the teacher suggested exercises in pairs. Chase looked around as if looking for a target. When the eyes met, it was as if time stopped for an instant. He pushed Bryce aside and said, "Let me go with one of them." Everyone looked. Ayla stepped forward, firm but serene. The teacher, oblivious to the weather, handed over a foam stick to simulate a balancing match. No aggression, guys, just technique. But there was something about Chase's gestures that was no joke. In the first move, he tried to destabilize her with force. Ayla retreated slightly, absorbing the impact without losing her balance. The second blow was more direct, aiming at the shoulder. She turned her body, swerving fluidly. And then, in a short turn, he positioned the stick on Chase's side with firmness and control. It didn't hurt, but it was humiliating. He fell to the ground without understanding how. The teacher let out a "oops," surprised. The other students laughed nervously. Chase stood up quickly, his face red. But Ayla had already backed down. She didn't even look at him. It disarmed him more than any punch. In the locker room after class, the atmosphere became dense. Chase angrily took off his sneakers, throwing his backpack on the bench. "That girl is messing with me." Bryce tried to lighten up. "It was just a fall, bro." But Chase didn't want to hear it. For him, it wasn't about technique. It was about pride, about losing space, about being challenged and by a small black girl who wouldn't even talk to him. And that, for a fragile ego like his, was unbearable. In his mind, it was no longer a game. It was war. On the way out, Chase stopped next to the sisters near the outer staircase that led to the courtyard. "Hey," he said, his voice full of tension. Amara turned her face slowly. Ayla stopped. "You think you're smart, right?" Neither answered. "This is not going to stay like this." Bryce and Eli were a few feet away, watching like hyenas. The problem was that he confused silence with submission, and what would come next would show that he made a fatal mistake. That night, in the backyard of their home, the twins trained with their grandfather without saying a word about what happened. But he did. Ayla's gaze was more focused. Amara's movements harder. "Breathe," he said. "Breathe before anything else." And they obeyed. But deep down, they knew they were preparing for something. The grandfather just watched without judging. He also knew the rhythm of a fight that comes from afar. Not every fight starts with a punch. Some begin with silences that are too long. At school, the next steps were being marked. Chase didn't know exactly when, but he had already decided. He didn't just want to take down Ayla or Amara. He wanted to prove something, not to others but to himself. And for that, he would have to cross a line. He just didn't know that by doing that, he would stop being a bully, to become just another name on the list of those who learned the hard way, which means underestimating someone who only looks small on the outside. The afternoon was emptier than usual in the back patio. The last bell had rang 15 minutes. Tagusul and most of the students were already on the buses or walking home. Ayla and Amara stayed a little longer, helping the art teacher stack some boxes in the creative club room. They enjoyed the silence of the late afternoon. No one screaming, no one looking. But that day, someone was waiting for them. When they left through the side door of the gym, they felt the cold wind hit their faces. And then they saw it. Chase, Bryce, Eli, standing near the trash cans, hands in pockets, staged expression of casualty. But the eyes, his eyes were full of poison. The sisters stopped. Ayla stayed one step ahead. He had loved behind, but not in retreat, in position. Chase gave a half smile. "We just want to talk." His voice was low, but he carried menace. Ayla did not answer. Amara tightened the strap of her backpack. The boys began to move. Bryce circled the sideline. Eli chewed gum, filming with his cell phone partially hidden in his sleeve. Chase stopped, less than 6 feet away. "Do you think you are special? That they are better than us because they are silent all the time?" The sisters remained motionless. Silence was the answer. And that's where Chase made his mistake. He took a sharp step forward and tried to push Ayla on the shoulder. But before his hand touched her, everything changed. Ayla spun her body, grabbed his wrist with precision, and in a single movement, destabilized him. Chase fell on his side, hitting the ground with a dry thud. Bryce moved forward on instinct, but Amara was already halfway there. A short turn, a side kick, and Bryce stumbled backwards, landing with his back against the metal railing. Eli took a hesitant step, but before he even tried anything, Ayla was already facing him. He raised his hands. "Calm down, calm down." It was 12 seconds. 12. Eli's camera captured everything. When he stopped recording, Ayla and Amara were already standing up, as if nothing had happened. There was no blood. There were no screams. Just 3 bodies on the ground trying to make sense of what had just happened. Chase coughed, clutching his chest. Bryce muttered an expletive. Eli was trembling. And the girls? They just adjusted their backpacks. Amara looked at her sister. Ayla nodded, and then the two walked calmly to the exit. Without saying a word, the principal appeared 5 minutes later, alerted by an employee who had heard the noise. When he arrived, he saw the three boys pulling themselves together. Chase tried to explain. They attacked us. But Eli said nothing. The video had already been posted. And in a matter of minutes, I was in all the groups at school. Silent, raw, impossible to deny. The comments exploded. Bro, they're like ninjas. I never mess with anyone silent again. Now I understand what it is to fight clean. The school went into turmoil. The next morning, Ayla and Amara walked as usual through the halls. But now, something had changed. The sound. There was no more mocking laughter, just whispers, respect, and fear. Teachers watched. Students led the way. Some even greeted with a shy nod. The girls didn't change at all, neither the steps nor the tone. But the world around them, this one had turned inside out. And everyone knew that Harper Ridge would never be the same after what they saw behind the gym. And the most curious thing of all is that they did not celebrate. They didn't smile. They did not count on advantage. Because for Ayla and Amara, that was not a victory. It was a reminder that the world tests those who remain silent, and that sometimes silence is only heard when it is accompanied by movement. But what would come next? No one was prepared. Because the video didn't just go viral. He ended up in the hands of someone who would change the course of everything. The video of the fight exploded before the director could even call a meeting. In less than 24 hours, it circulated in groups of students, parents, and even in martial arts forums in the region. There was no screaming, no swearing, no sensationalist soundtrack. There were only two small girls, with serene faces disassembling three larger boys with clean, technical, and coldly precise movements. The silence of the video was what was most impressive. It was like watching something forbidden, a truth that no one was ready to face. Those girls were not victims. But they were not villains either. They were something rarer. They were prepared. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was one of contained chaos. The vice principal pressed the bridge of her nose with her fingers. The advisor typed angrily on the keyboard. And the director, sitting with the video paused on the screen, just watched it on a loop. Chase swore he was attacked without provocation. Bryce avoided talking. Eli disappeared. And Ayla and Amara? They attended with impeccable uniforms and calm looks. When asked, they gave only one answer. We only defended ourselves. No theater. Without dramatic justification. And that's exactly what left adults baffled. The school board was called, and with it came the rumors. They are dangerous. They must be trained to hurt. Is this acceptable behavior in a school? Questions flew from all sides, but none of them talked about the root of the problem. What caused it? The video showed the reaction, but no one wanted to discuss the action. The culture of silence, of tolerated provocation, of hidden intimidation. This does not go viral. This does not generate likes. But for those who live inside, it is what builds the tension to the point of the fuse. At home, the girl's grandfather turned off his cell phone after watching the video. He said nothing. He just looked at Ayla and Amara and asked, "Did you hurt anyone?" Ayla replied, "Not like we could." The old man nodded, and he went back to taking care of the plants. He knew the weight that came after. Because the world is not used to seeing the fragile win without shouting, and much less when the fragile wins without looking angry. This breaks the invisible rules. This is more frightening than the violence itself. At school, the reaction was divided. Some students began to follow the girls with mute admiration, others afraid. But something started to happen. Boys who had previously mocked started to look inside. Groups began to avoid the easy jokes. Even teachers began to rethink who they chose as natural leaders in the class. And meanwhile, the board was preparing the inevitable, an official hearing with the school board to determine the permanence of the students in the face of the altercation. The summons came on a Friday afternoon. Formal meeting. Monday at 2 p.m., mandatory attendance. The girls should be accompanied by a guardian. The tone was cold, bureaucratic, as if the school was dealing with criminals. The grandfather sighed deeply as he read the letter. So let's play by their rules. And he spent the weekend helping Ayla and Amara put together a dossier with all the details. Dates, previous teasing, the history of Chase and his friends. Not angry, but with method, because now it wasn't just a physical fight, it was a battle of narrative. And in this arena, silence was not enough. The girls were about to face a room full of adults who, even unintentionally, had already decided who the problem was. And that was what hurt the most. Not being heard until someone was on the ground. But what Harper Ridge didn't already know, this story was far from over. And the words that would come later would be sharper than any blow. The morning after receiving the letter from the hearing, the mood at the school was unrecognizable. The cafeteria, normally dominated by the screams and jokes of Chase and his friends, was silent. The trio no longer occupied the central table. Chase now ate looking down. Bryce sat a chair away. Eli didn't even show up. It was as if the gods of the school had fallen, and no one knew whether to celebrate or hide. The fear was no longer of the sisters. It was of what they represented. Living proof that power changes sides when those who are silent learn to stand up. Teachers began to change their behavior without admitting it. The discipline coordinator, who had never looked at Ayla or Amara beyond the roll call, began to ask if everything was okay. The physical education teacher no longer called them for pairs. He just said, "You can choose where you prefer to train." It was clear. They didn't know how to deal with it. They were not prepared for black girls, small and quiet, who did not ask permission or forgiveness to exist. They did not demand respect. They forced recognition. The informal structure of the school also trembled. Students who had previously mocked him now imitated his gestures. Some tried to start a conversation, others just avoided looking. A 7th grade boy left a note on their desk. "I wish I was like you." It was signed with the shaky handwriting of someone who was still learning to write with courage. In the library, a group of 6th grade girls sat next to the sisters and began mimicking their breathing workouts. The silence of the girls had become a new language, one who dispensed applause, but taught firmness with presence. Meanwhile, Chase was desperately trying to regain his place. He spread rumors that the video was edited, that he was taken by surprise, that he only didn't hit it back because he was a knight. But no one bought the story anymore. Even his most faithful allies distanced themselves. The truth was no longer a matter of who spoke louder. It was a matter of who stood tall. And Ayla and Amara had never been more stable than they are now. Fear changed its face. And with it, he changed the social map of Harper Ridge. Behind the scenes, the director tried to contain the fire without assuming that she had let it start. He sent bulletins to his parents. He called emergency meetings. He created committees to promote peace among students. But everything seemed late. The whole school had already watched the story. And unlike other times, no one could pretend they didn't know what happened. There was evidence, witnesses, and most importantly, there was a change happening that no longer fit on the Secretariat's forms. The girl's grandfather, at home, maintained his unshakable routine. He watered the plants, he prepared coffee, and he read the documents of the hearing as if reviewing old battlefield stories. He knew that this type of fight was more dangerous because it didn't involve punching. It involved reputations, and that of his granddaughters was being thrown against a wall by those who, even unintentionally, saw a threat where there was only competence. But he was not afraid. He knew well the two types of war, the one that is won with technique, and that which is overcome with truth. On Friday, the eve of the hearing, Harper Ridge looked like a castle about to collapse. The school's social leadership no longer came from the soccer team, but from two girls that no one knew before the semester began. And that made a lot of people uncomfortable. Because when respect is not built with shouting but with posture, it lasts longer, and it scares more. And Ayla and Amara, they just kept going to school as usual. simple backpacks, light steps, and the eyes of those who have never lowered their heads because they never needed to. The hearing room was cold, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the climate. In the center, a long, dark wood table with 6 chairs on each side. On one side, the principal, the disciplinary advisor, and 2 members of the council. On the other, Ayla, Amara, and her grandfather, old suit, well-groomed beard, look of someone who has seen a lot of war without having to raise his voice. The girls had a clean uniform, their hair was well braided, and their eyes were firm. They had no lawyer, they had no support from groups, they had only their own posture and the truth. The principal opened the meeting by reading a protocol statement. This hearing aims to investigate the conduct of students Ayla and Amara Tolliver in the altercation that occurred in the schoolyard on the date of the incident. The words seemed heavy, bureaucratic, as if they already came with the weight of condemnation. Then, the video was shown. Short, no cuts. Chase's fall, Ayla's turn, Amara's retreat, the end in silence. When the video ended, no one spoke. Adults looked at the girls as if looking for some invisible flaw. The principal coughed, trying to appear neutral. "We have reports that the students have a history of training in martial arts. Is that true?" Grandfather answered before they could open their mouths. "Yes, since he was 4 years old. And they have never, ever been taught to attack, but to resist, and if necessary, to defend." The coordinator made quick notes. A board member looked up. "But isn't this ability in itself a threat to other students?" The grandfather sighed. "Skill is never a threat. The intention is." Before any judgment was made, a knock on the door interrupted the tension. She was the school secretary, with a student by her side, Delaney Forrester, 7th grade student. Round glasses, hair tied in a messy bun, green wool blouse. Trembling a little, he asked to speak. With hesitation, he sat down and said, "I've seen everything behind the gym. I was drawing the trash cans. I saw Chase push. I saw the others surround. And I saw the girls ask him to stop. Twice." The room was muted. The director widened her. Why didn't you tell it before?" Delaney lowered his head. "Because I was afraid of being dragged into all this. But when I saw that they were being blamed, I realized that my silence hurt too." The statement fell like a stone in the center of the table. The principal looked at the other members of the board. The coordinator stopped writing, and the girl's grandfather simply tilted his head slightly, as if recognizing an act of courage worth 1,000 words. The hearing ended with the promise of a new deliberation. The girls left in silence, but this time accompanied by a new kind of energy. It was not fear, it was presence. The kind of presence that is conquered not with shouts, but with truth sustained at the right time. Outside, the sky was clear, and the grandfather just said, "Sometimes the most important voice isn't the loudest, it is the one that comes after fear." And for the first time since it all began, Amara smiled. The email with the decision arrived the next day. Ayla and Amara would not be punished. The school recognized the legitimate use of self-defense in the face of registered provocation. The final grade said, "The students demonstrated control, discipline, and maturity in the face of a hostile situation." The grandfather printed the email and pasted it on the fridge, right next to a photo of the 2 still children, with training gloves and innocent looks. The truth has been heard, not in the scream, but in a low voice. And sometimes, it's that kind of voice that changes everything. The following week, Harper Ridge looked like another school. The buzz still existed, but it was different. There was no longer whispering about the strangers who beat the boys, but about the sisters who defended themselves with honor. The video was still circulating, but now accompanied by new captions. "Strength is not volume. Silence is not fear." The twins returned to their routine with the same tranquility as always. Snack in the corner, synchronized step, measured speech. But everyone knew nothing there was the same as before. Chase, Bryce, and Eli walked farther apart, like birds that had lost control of the air. The table where they sat was emptier. The jokes dried up. Even teachers began to look at the sisters more closely, not with fear, but with care. Some students began to approach with genuine curiosity, others just out of respect. A 6th grade boy asked Amara if she could show that cool spin that knocked the big guy down. She smiled but did not answer. Isla just said, "First, you learn to breathe." A group of girls formed a new club at school, Strength in Silence. Inspired by the sisters, they began to hold conversation circles, exchange diaries, and learn basic self-defense techniques with videos on YouTube. The school, still frightened by what it experienced, tried to organize everything under the name of extracurricular activity of emotional well-being. But the students knew the truth. It was not born from an institutional project. It was born to 2 girls who never asked to lead, only to be left alone. Ayla and Amara didn't want to be famous. They didn't want to go viral. But they understood that sometimes the world chooses its symbols, and it is up to those who carry this weight to decide what to do with it. When the literature teacher asked them to write a text about what respect meant, Ayla handed them a sheet with sentence, "Respect is not asked, it sustains itself." The teacher did not comment. He just put the phrase on the wall at the entrance, without a name. Who knew, knew. At the end of the quarter, Ayla and Amara were invited to represent the class at the closing ceremony. Refused. They indicated Delaney, and it was she who took the stage, wearing a blue skirt and trembling voice, to thank the people who show us that courage doesn't always make noise. The school applauded, not standing, but really, the kind of applause that comes when silence has taught more than 1,000 citizenship classes. On the way out, as the hallways emptied out for the start of the holidays, Amara stopped at the water cooler and saw something unexpected. Chase, alone, leaning against the closet, staring at the floor. They looked at each other for a second. He didn't say anything. Neither did she, he just walked away. And in that gesture, there was more power than any revenge. Because knowing when to fight is strength, but knowing when not to fight back. It's what turns an ordinary person into an example. On the way home, the sisters walked as usual, side by side, worn backpacks, blue ribbons in her hair. But now, something was walking with them. An invisible trail of something new. It wasn't fame, it was not fear, it was influence. The rarest of all, the one that is neither asked nor forced, but conquered by presence, coherence, and courage. Because sometimes the most important battles don't happen in the ring, but in the silence of those who choose to continue. Even when the whole world doubts that you belong. Not every fight leaves bruises. Some leave silence. They leave looks that avoid, corridors that open up, words that have never been said but that everyone has felt. Ayla and Amara did not ask to be a symbol of anything. But when injustice is repeated in silence, a firm response is enough to break the cycle. And the most beautiful. They did not win by force. They won by calm. For discipline. For the courage, not to conform to what was expected of them. Because the world tests those who are small, tests those who are quiet, tests those who don't fit the mold. But sometimes who gets beaten up the most in life? It is the one who carries the force that transforms everything. And when that force decides to show up, there's no bully, no rumor, no system that stands. If this story touched something in you, so it's past time to subscribe to this channel. Because here it's not just about stories, it's about seeing what the world tries to hide. That behind every silence, there may be a revolution about to happen. Turn on notifications. Share with someone who needs to be reminded. Being small is not being weak. And in the comments, say, "I'm learning to stand."